standing here and you go quiet, just like that. Welcome to the question time session. You've got questions I hope that you're going to ask, otherwise this will be a very, very short session indeed. I have some questions myself up my sleeve, but please, if you've got questions for the panel, would you bring them to me now in the next few minutes before we go live on stream, on the web. You can write them down on a piece of paper if you like. You can put your name on them, or you don't have to put your name on them. But also, we have several colleagues here who will be on the panel ready to answer your questions. I'd suggest you make the questions as difficult as possible. Not Nicky Morgan difficult, a lot more difficult than that. All right, so that you make them really think and have to kind of, well, I don't know whether we can get them to squirm in their seats or not, but we'll certainly get them thinking hard about answering your questions. So, if you've got any questions, then bring them to me on a piece of paper, either anonymous or with your name on them. Okay, now there has been some, before we start, there has been some consternation about how you should write your assignments. I've had people emailing me, I've had people coming to see me. Who's concerned about the way you're going to write your assignment? Put your hand up, admit it, go on. Right, so there's quite a few, over half of you. Hopefully we will try to address that today as well. But my view on this is quite simple. So listen up, this is my view on this. This is about you engaging with your vocation as a teacher. This is about you telling us why you do what you do as a teacher. It's about your beliefs, your opinions, your philosophy. Clearly you're going to have to support that and give evidence as to why you think that way or believe that way or do that thing. But essentially this is your assignment, this is your last chance before you leave this university to shine and to tell us why you believe what you do about education. You can draw on philosophy, you can draw on politics, you can draw on society, you can draw on culture, you can draw on methodology, research, all of these areas to make that happen. But the way you write your assignment will be totally different to the way everyone else writes theirs. So my advice to you would be, don't listen to any other students. Do it your way. Be critical, engage with the theories, engage with the literature critically, try to evaluate your ideas in the light of these theories, and try to make your argument as convincing and as supported as possible. That's my advice. I'm sure my colleagues here will give you their advice as well on that. But that would be my advice to you. I hope that helps. So, I'm going to invite 3 members of our panel to come up. We will switch around a bit. But I think that we'll start with inviting Phil to come up. So, Phil Selbie, please. And then we have Kath. And there are 2 spare seats. We will later on have some more guests, but surprise guest for you right now, Kelly Davis. And I'm going to start with some questions to begin with. And I think that you'll have the microphone. I'll give you this microphone here, okay? And I'll use this microphone here. And there is a microphone down the front here, which James is going to run around with. So please put your hands up when you've got a question, or also bring the paper to the front to me if you've got a written piece of question that you want to have the panel present or discuss. Now I've got a few notes here myself. First question to the panel. Is our education system completely broken? You need to talk right into the microphone.
Yeah, who would like to go first?
Is the education system in this country completely broken?
Well, Steve, I think the government's education policy is completely broken, and but that doesn't necessarily mean that the education system is completely broken. But I think what has happened very recently, the news broke this morning about the SPAG test for Year 6, but other blunders along the way in the last 3 months, probably beginning with the decision to not make the baseline test for reception statutory in September, as has been the case for the last year and a half of government policy, shows that certainly those people that are leading and doing their best to manage the system are, I think, in my view, very out of touch. In terms of the education system itself, let me say that despite what I've said and what people do say about is happening in this country with regard to education, British education system worldwide is very, very highly regarded, believe it or not. I taught overseas for a number of years, and in the international sector, let's say, many parents want their children to have an English or a British education system or a British education because of the reputation that it's had in the past, and I think it's fair to say that it still, despite the criticisms, contains some very dedicated professionals, some very creative professionals. The issue for me is that they're not always allowed to have the free rein, perhaps, that they should have.
I was talking to Steve before we began this afternoon and said that what I am strongly tempted to do for this afternoon session is to do some role play and to sit here and imagine what it would be like if I was Nicky Morgan. This is quite a dangerous way of working, I think, this afternoon, and I'm going to try it simply because there's nothing like putting yourself in the position or in the shoes of somebody whose views you do not subscribe to, and to actually think about how the government would answer your questions in order to explore why it's working as it is or not working as it is. So I think if I was a government representative, Nicky Morgan or somebody else, is that I would say, no, it isn't broken, and that it is very much the purpose of this government to plan and to execute through its schools a much better education system than we have at the moment. And it's the government policies of testing with higher demands and higher expectations, it's with academisation, that it's those endeavours that are actually going to make our education system stronger than it is. So it's not broken, there are issues with it, but it is government policy that is going to make it even stronger than it is at the moment.
Thank you, Nicky. That's right, Kath. Well, it's Nicky, isn't it now? Kelly.
Okay, so I would say that aspects of our education system are broken, and I would say one of the aspects is particularly the focus at the moment of our education system, particularly around assessment of children, as we've all read about in the news. However, there are some very positive aspects of our education system that we should highlight. Our teachers, educational professionals within that are amazing. My concern in terms of the focus with assessment is how is that going to impact our teachers? It is already negatively impacting people in terms of pressure and therefore potentially them wishing to not stay in the teaching profession, so retention is an issue at the moment. And also the children. that we teach, the pressure, the stress that they are under to perform with the data-driven mentality of the education system at the moment, which concerns me.
Well, let me ask you this question then. Start off with you, Kelly, and then I'll go to Kath stroke Nikki, and then finally Phil on this one. Key Stage 2 SATS tests. We all know, and it's been admitted, that actually they're not for the benefit of the children, they are for the measuring of the quality of the school. That's the metric that the government's interested in here. So should we abolish Key Stage 2 SATs? Should we get rid of them?
I actually think we should. And the reason I think that is because I don't think it's beneficial to our children or our teachers. I think we should be placing more trust in the teachers to be able to assess children accurately, and whether we need to change the system in terms of how that is quality assured to ensure that there is consistency across schools, then that needs to be looked into.
What say you from the government perspective then?
From a government perspective, absolutely not. It's our deliberate policy to drive up standards by having attainment tests at the end of key stages. And it is those tests that will drive up those standards, because it is the government's way, and it is indeed the country's way and parents' way of ensuring that what is the right thing to be taught in schools is actually taught.
But come on. This is putting huge pressure onto children, it's putting huge pressure onto teachers, it's putting huge pressure on the parents. Is it really worth all that stress?
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not talking about pressure, but teachers are there to do their job. And what
You
they
won't have any
really
teachers
need
left.
to do, what teachers really need to do is help parents, is help children, and is help the country actually make teaching and make schools and make our education system a really positive place to be at the moment. We've had months and months of negativity about schools, and it really is time that teachers said, yes, we are part of a whole scheme to really drive up standards and improve our education system and make sure that England competes on a level playing field with countries all around the world. And that is the purpose of our education system, and that is the role that testing plays.
I can't see how actually assessment in that sense is for the children. I still can't see that. What do you say, Phil?
Well, very convincing, Nikki, but I'm afraid that I think that, to just go back to the first question, should we abolish SATs? I don't think we should abolish testing in Year 6. What I think we should abolish is a standardised test and reporting to central government, because that's where the sinister, for want of a better word, part of it all lies, is that it's being used in a way to not just measure progress, but hold schools to account to a centralised benchmark, if you like, so that we can demonstrate, so that government and your colleagues, Nikki, can demonstrate how well they are spending taxpayers' money, because there's nothing dearer to a voter's heart, especially if they have children or grandchildren, as to how well the public education system is performing. And that's where the focus has got lost, has been taken away from children. Nothing wrong with testing, but it's what is done with that data that is the problem.
Can I clarify there, Phil?
Yeah.
What you're saying is that if it's published, then it becomes a measure for the government to use. But if it's not published, then it actually serves the purpose it's meant to serve.
Yes, I think children, in one way or another, have always been tested or assessed, whether it's pencil and paper or something more informal or formative like teacher observation. And I think individual schools, when you and I were at school, were making judgments and doing times tables tests, spellings tests and so on, and probably something at the end of each year or at the end of term in order to make comparisons internally. But they were never returned, data was never returned, as far as I was aware anyway, to the local authority, and certainly not, because now we have the technology to do it, returned online to some central database and then crunched and published in newspapers and so on and so forth. That's where it's all gone awry.
Let's have some comments from the audience now. James has got the microphone here and he's going to come around. Who's got a comment on testing and assessment? So here to start, then over at the back there, so two on the side, and over here on the left afterwards. Okay, so there's 3 comments here. We'll take the 3 comments and then come back to the panel.
Okay, I think that...
Is the mic on?
Yeah, what's around?
Well, we need the microphone on so that the people online can hear you as well. Is it working?
I'll work on you, John. It's nice to... Oh, wait,
There we go.
what was I going to say? Yeah, I think it's a good way of introducing children to some sort of responsibility, because SATs don't actually mean something to the children after they've taken place, but it kind of means something to them in the build-up towards them. I think that they have a sense of responsibility, like they're being responsible for their own test in a way, but if it doesn't turn out how they wanted it to, it's fine, and it is the first time they've been tested properly. But if it doesn't turn out successfully, then it doesn't matter, because SATs don't affect children.
SATs don't affect children?
Not really, no. No, I mean, they don't affect their later lives. They get stressed over them, and that's really sad, because for something that doesn't affect them that much, it shouldn't be that much of a stress factor.
Okay, thank you for that viewpoint. Is there anyone else at the back there? Jonathan at the back there wants to have his say.
My question is, how valuable are standardised tests such as SATs as a measure of what children have learned in their school career?
Okay, so we're talking about the validity now of the testing. So would anyone in the panel like to respond to that, Kelly?
In terms of how valuable they are, I would argue that they're not particularly valuable. I think there's a lot of teaching to the test that goes on, and I think that children and adults can retain facts for a short period of time, but whether their understanding is developed is a different matter. And I saw that a lot when I was teaching in secondary schools. I think I may have discussed this before, but we would get highly elevated scores for science, and then they would come into the classroom and their ability in science would be significantly lower than had been assessed by the tests.
But if you did away with the test, like you said earlier, what would you replace them with? There needs to be something to measure children's progress, surely.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think well, the government have brought in for science in particular, obviously as a scientist I'm going to talk about science, we were talking about this earlier, sample testing, so selecting certain schools and children to take part in tests on science from years 3 to 6, and this is based on the new national curriculum. Now, again, you might ask, what is the difference between this and a SAT? But actually, I don't think there is much difference. I think we should, in some respects, test children because they are going to need to do tests later on in their lives. But again, with Phil, I agree that actually it's how those results are used and analysed, and the pressure and the implications for the children and the teachers that are the issue. I think if we're going to test children, then maybe we should be looking at real-time testing. And I was having a discussion with James earlier about the fact that perhaps we should be looking at testing in the way that we look at no-notice Ofsted inspections. So we're getting a real-time picture of what the children know, no one's elevating anything, no one's getting pressurised to do a certain thing at a certain time, and look at actually what, for example, is their science like? Is it being taught? Etc.
Okay, so that's fine. You're advertising, advocating. You could be advertising, I don't know, but you're advocating continuous assessment, really, aren't you? What do you say to that from the government perspective?
Well, from the government's perspective, I mean, it's always good to hear the views of a practitioner. However, I think so far what we've missed is the point that one of the great strengths of the SATs tests is that they give standardisation across the country. It's all well and good individual schools having their own version of the tests and their own assessments, but there's no moderation, there's no standardisation. What we need is a system that shows that children have reached this age-related level or age-related expectation that we want them to have across the country. And that's the real strength of a national testing procedure. But I mean, on the back of that, in between year 2 and year 6, of course, what we've done is given schools complete autonomy in terms of their formative testing and how they track children's progress. Huge amount of freedom there to set up systems within schools whereby they can assess their own children in the way that they need to do. And I feel that that's a real strength of government policy, is that level of autonomy that we've given.
Can you standardise learning then?
You can certainly standardise the kind of knowledge that we have agreed that our children in primary schools should have by the time they move on to secondary school. So that when they're in secondary school, we've called it being secondary ready, that children have that basis and that knowledge that is going to allow them to unlock the Key Stage 3 and particularly the Key Stage 4 curriculum for when they do their exams and move on to further qualifications. We need that baseline, that benchmark of knowledge that children should have in order that they can move on effectively.
So Phil, the question was, is SATs a valid or accurate representation of a child's learning?
I have to put my hand up here for those people that don't know me, that I'm an early years specialist, so I don't have any experience of setting, marking and so on. Certainly the Key Stage 2 SATs. I can only answer from a principal point of view is that I don't think they assess holistically, to use an early years term particularly, the all-round abilities and attributes towards learning that we want our future citizens of this country to have. What I'd like to do is just to return to Nikki's little speech just then, which was very eloquent, but if you listen carefully to her, she said on more than, I think, 3 occasions, we need. And the issue is, it's not the government that needs testing and the information that apparently comes from it. Actually, the purpose of testing or assessment in any shape or form is actually for the professionals, it's actually for the benefit of children. And the government, in my view, is there to ensure adequate funding through local authorities, adequate places for schools for children, and to ensure that the fabric of the education system in terms of building and so on and so forth, qualifications of the teaching profession are to a high standard, and the local community are the people who should ultimately require that sort of information. And I'm talking about parents, I'm talking about local government. Unfortunately, this government seems to be on a drive and has been for the last, certainly since 2010, a drive to take away local accountability by removing local authority influence in the education system, which is very, at best, sad, at worst quite of some concern, because it means that everything is going to central government, and everything is dictated from the middle, and everything has to conform to a one-size-fits-all, which doesn't take account of the local picture, if you like, and is not the responsibility of locally elected people in the local authority.
Well, we'll come back to the issues
Can I
of
just
academisation in a moment. Go on, Kath.
Can I just
Nikki.
come back on that? I mean, if we're going to look at government policy, then the whole policy of decentralisation and conversion to academies actually began under the previous Labour governments. And what we did starting in 2010 and since our outright election, we have a clear mandate from the electorate in 2015 to ensure that schools are reaching the standards that they should. And we were voted in as a clear Conservative majority over a coalition government of 2010 to continue that driving up of standards through schools that have autonomy, that have freedom, that head teachers have the power and the autonomy to respond to the needs of their children and their communities.
Nick, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
We understand that you recently failed one of the SPAG test questions, but you've also failed to do your homework, because the academy system was actually introduced under the previous Labour administration before 2010, but it was actually brought in to work with local, particularly secondary schools in the first instance, in very challenging areas, to raise standards, admittedly, but raise standards in areas of high deprivation and where schools were not secondary schools were not making progress. So schools were converted to academies with the help of the local authorities, and they were given additional money in the misguided belief to some degree that actually throwing money at a problem will solve and raise standards. But nevertheless, it was a localised initiative. It wasn't this sort of academisation explosion that we've seen, particularly in the last 12 or 18 months.
Okay, well, as I said before, we will come
No,
back to that.
I really do need to answer.
We will. No.
I'm
You'll have a chance.
disappointed.
You'll have a chance in a moment.
That
to answer
just
that.
like
Please,
me,
Secretary, please.
You
would you-
reduce
Right, can we
the
move the
whole
microphone
idea
across to
of the
here,
SATs
Kath?
test to its
Because,
lowest common
I
denominator.
think we might have to get the bouncers in a moment. But so we will come back to that later on. But there's another question over here that needs to be asked, I think. What's your question?
So my question is for Nikki. You were saying earlier about the strengths of the SATs tests, and you were saying that some of the strengths are as it measures children's age-related expectations, their progress, how we can improve the curriculum and prepare them for obviously like key stages 3 and 4, and it measures a benchmark of all their knowledge. But how come the SATs tests are only measuring maths and English? What about music? If that's the strengths of the SATs tests, why is not every subject measured in that way?
That's a really good question. I don't need your help, thank you. Research and development of policy over the years has shown that children and young people's knowledge and skills in English and maths are absolutely key to their own development and their own knowledge and understanding. With those basic skills developed to a high level by the end of primary school in English and maths, they are the key for our young people to unlock their learning in key stages 3 and 4. I wouldn't want a system where children were doing tests in all of the other subjects. I think that really would put them under really unsupportable pressure. But it's absolutely vital that we have that knowledge, and they have that knowledge, and their teachers do, about English and maths, because they are the key subjects within the primary curriculum.
Okay, we're joined on the stage now by Miles Opie. Welcome. I'll give him a few minutes to acclimatise himself to this, because we're actually talking around the idea of assessment and testing and the issues that come from that. There's a question in the middle of it. I don't know if we can get the microphone into the middle over here, James, can we? And put your hand up over here if you've got questions as well, and elsewhere. Okay, go ahead.
If you're saying that English and maths is the most important things, do you not think we should be assessing sort of the characteristics of learning? Because I think it would be just as important to have individuals that can question and that are resilient and can persevere, rather than just recall information.
That's a good question. Who wants to answer that?
Was that question directed?
Was that directed at Nikki? Right, okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll start, and obviously I will pass it on to my colleagues. I absolutely agree with you. Our children and young people need grit and determination and resilience in order to face whatever future it is that they face. But it's one that is going to be quite difficult to test and to measure and to come up with an agreed standard of what an age-related expectation is in resilience, for example. Whereas, of course, it's much more straightforward to do that in English and maths. But I quite agree with you that schools do need to be taking into account children's ability to cope in this very challenging future that they have. And it's teachers' duty, it's your duty, to make sure that they can do.
Who wants to comment? Miles, would you like to comment on the question at all? You've just arrived.
Just some more of the question again.
The microphone.
Just returning like that we do assess those things in the early years through observation, so why can't that be carried through up until the later stages?
So you're making the point, the case really, that teacher assessment is important here, right? Is teacher assessment perhaps more appropriate, Miles, than SATs at that stage of their education?
Yes.
Why?
No, in my opinion, the assessment is looking at a moment in time. So if you're assessing a child on a particular day, you're capturing that moment, and often it's their recall. Whereas I think teacher assessment, which can be over a period of time, gives you a clearer, truer picture of that child's ability over time.
Of course, the government would hate that because it's not really measurable in the sense that you can publish it. And they want you to publish your results so that they can show where you are in the league table as a school, don't they?
Yes, they do.
So there's a big problem there.
And do we need to know? Do we need to know how good one school is compared to another at a particular test? Or is it actually about the individual child's progress, which is more important than knowing how well the school's doing?
Anyone else want to come back on that? Phil, did you want to talk about...
Sorry, I'm a bit distracted because I'm trying to find something that Nikki said
on the website, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll come to Kelly, fill in and answer your question from your perspective.
I think I totally agree with you, and I think observation is very important, particularly at primary school level. However, at some point, we, in our later stages of education, will need to sit tests at the moment, won't we? We'll need to sit GCSE exams, we'll need to sit A-levels, because at the moment that's what's happening, and has been happening for a while. I'm not suggesting that...
You're talking about the current regime though, but
yeah.
The thing is, education is a political football. As another government comes in, so the regime will change and testing will change, won't it?
Maybe, I don't know. It's. I mean, if you said to me, you know, could we abolish all testing and just go with teacher assessment throughout the entire of a child's education, an adult's education, that would be, you know, that would be ideally what would be great, because it would hopefully remove some pressure and would remove the concept of having to be good for an hour on a particular day. But then we've got to look at how that would actually be practical. And the fact is, although, Nikki, I don't really want to agree with you on many things, the fact is we have situations where we have teachers who are off sick, they're perhaps long-term ill, a class may have supply teachers for long periods of time, and what do we do in those circumstances when the children maybe don't know the teacher and that teacher doesn't know them, and how do we inform assessment in that respect? I do have questions over how this would practically be possible throughout the entire duration of someone's education.
The part of the question here, maybe our education secretary can address this. Part of the question was about critical thinking, wasn't it? You mentioned critical thinking. Who was it over here? Mentioned critical thinking, wasn't it? And also, was it problem solving? In other words, the transferable skills. How can you take SATs and measure that? You can't do that. It's impossible to do that with SATs, is it not?
It's very difficult to do that with SATs, but can I just take a moment just to come back on something that
You're not answering the question.
So good. I just want to come back on something
You're skirting the question.
that my colleague here said, that the notion that we need that information. Miles, isn't it? Is it Miles? Yes. I couldn't actually quite believe that I was hearing this, that who needs to know how schools are performing? I think that's what you said. Well, parents need to know. Parents have the right to know how the schools that they are sending their children to are performing. They need to be able to make choices for their children as to which school to send them to.
Okay,
As from a taxpayer, may I finish? From a taxpayer's point of view, but also their parents, those children are so precious to them, they need to be able to make informed decisions and informed judgments. And how a school is performing in national standardised testing is one really important way of parents being able to find that.
Okay, thank you. You had your say. Now move the microphone across, please. The gentleman here.
Nikki, that was the most patronising nanny state comment that I think I've heard so far this afternoon. I return to my point earlier on. We need to know, you need to know, the government needs to know. The government does not need to know these things. It's the responsibility of parents to know and to find out, and for schools to be held accountable by parents and the local community, not central government. The way you speak sounds like local authorities, local groups, parents don't have the skills or the position enough to be able to find out these things themselves, and so therefore it must all come to central government and then be reinterpreted back out to the proletariat. It really is. I'm quite amazed. I just won't be voting Tory next election.
Well, obviously I'm very disappointed and totally unsurprised to hear that comment. However, one of the many reasons that we have extended the academisation process is in order for schools to work in the way that you are describing with their parents. There have been, over the years, too many examples of local authorities who have not bitten the bullet and have not worked with their local schools in order to drive up standards. And that really is why we have needed to reduce the power of local authorities, ineffectual local authorities. There are some good ones, but a huge number of ineffectual ones who have not driven up standards in our primary schools, and it is a parent's right to know that the school they are sending their children to is the best that it can possibly be.
Right, we're going to move on to a question over here.
Phil sort of mentioned the comment that Nikki was making the assumption that parents and schools aren't trusted to talk to each other. They have to have the test in order to communicate sort of thing, which was what Phil was saying.
So that is an interesting question. Would anyone like to address that? Phil first, perhaps?
Just say that again, would you, Selbie?
Can you reiterate?
It wasn't a question, it was more a comment that Nikki made about that parents need to know, have to have the test to know what's going on in the school, but then that's making the assumption that teachers don't talk to parents, sort of thing.
Yeah, really, is the SATs becoming almost like a mediation tool between teachers and parents? Probably not, but that's probably how the government wishes it to be seen.
Certainly, the recent white paper, Educational Excellence Everywhere, and I think that says an awful lot, doesn't it? I mean, while that might be an aspiration, I think it's rather a neat way of phrasing things, 3 E's, and it sounds rather, well, I won't say the word. I think that under Education Excellence Everywhere, the white paper, one of the things that the government is doing as well with regard to governance was actually suggesting that governing bodies need no longer have parents on the governing bodies, and that's been a way in the past for information about what's happening in schools to be disseminated to the local community, as well as through other members of the local community being on governing bodies. So it seems to me that there seems to be an erosion, if you like, of what has traditionally been quite a free exchange of information and open channels to everything must be mediated through statistical information that's processed and crunched by the government and then fed out through the media. And frankly, it's distorted. And I think one of the things that we have not yet touched upon is the fact that there's an awful lot of money tied up in publishing, administering and marking SATs. We talked about stress on teachers and children, but think of the public money that is being spent on this accountability system. I dread to think how many billions of pounds is being used purely to gather data to be able to report on the progress and standards in schools. I think it's unnecessary.
Okay, we have a question over here. The microphone is coming to you. Because you're in the middle, it might take some time to get to you. Oh, long legs, here we go. Right.
What would happen if we removed the government from the education system?
So what would happen if we were to remove the government from the education system? Good question. Kelly?
Well, if we remove them completely, I'm wondering who would, would it be teachers? Who are you suggesting would kind of oversee things?
Should we qualify the question here? Are you saying we remove the government from control of the curriculum or from administering education per se?
So remove them from administering the tests.
Right, okay.
And the curriculum be a guideline rather than a you must follow this.
So the curriculum being a guideline rather than this is graven in stone, this is what you must do, and the levels and so on, and to not administer testing anymore.
Well, obviously the curriculum is a guideline in some schools, depending on the school, and it's from my knowledge and understanding of those schools, some of those schools are very successful and have good results because they perhaps put more weighting on a teacher's ability to be able to carry out formative assessment on individual children and to be able to report effectively on those children. And many of those children thrive in that environment, and that's my experience.
Okay, Miles, your response, what would happen if we remove the government from that part of the equation?
I'd like to think that putting the power back towards schools and the local areas would mean that the curriculum would evolve, hopefully become more creative, more appropriate for the children, so that the schools could actually look at teaching the children under their care in a way which would benefit them, rather than thinking about what do we want them to be as a national person, but actually thinking actually what's right for this child. So I think the good schools will move towards a more child-centred model, actually looking at the basics. I think the basics will happen. I think your basic skills would happen because I think teachers feel that they're important, but maybe not to the degree that they have to be tested and proven. So I think the trust would be there, and I think schools would become more individual.
You seem to be implying that in the current system there's less space for creativity than we need. Is that what you're saying?
I think at the moment the focus is way too much English and maths. And I think what would happen, particularly this time of the year, if you go into schools in the last few weeks, there are certain year groups who've only been doing English maths for maybe the last 3-4 weeks, maybe longer, possibly even since Christmas. It'll allow freedom to actually involve with what's happening. So maybe we've got a push towards things like outdoor education. Maybe we'll connect more with the local environment. We can actually adapt to things seasonally, not thinking, oh, it's spring now, it's SATs, it's preparation for SATs, but actually it's spring now, what's happening outside, let's involve ourselves in that.
Well, we've got to hear from the government perspective on this now, haven't we? Are you looking to continue your ideology of a decentralised approach to education?
What we are looking to do is to make sure that the education that our children receive in our primary schools and in our secondary schools is of the highest possible standard, and that government needs to retain a role within that. If we don't have a national curriculum, then I think we would be doing our children and young people a great disservice. And then what we would be doing is returning to the, frankly, wishy-washy pre-national curriculum days, pre-1988, when standards in primary schools were shown to be falling dramatically because there was no consensus about what it was that children were being taught and what it was that they were learning. And we had schools doing random topics and themes, different all over the country. We need that standardisation. Parents need to know that the education, the equal right to an education of the highest possible standard is going to be wherever they live in the country, whether their child is going to be educated in Hull or they're going to move to Helston. That having a national curriculum with nationally agreed standards is a child's right and a parent's right to a first-class education system, and we need that standardising government role in order to fulfil that.
And you're going down the academy route, isn't that a contradiction? We'll come back to you on that question.
Can I just ask you a question then? So since 1988, has it worked?
1988 was the
curriculum. So since national curriculum was introduced, do we now have a high quality standard education for every child in the UK?
It is considerably better than it was in 1988. Education standards, as measured by our SATs tests and by our examination systems and by the PISA tests, shows that actually England and the education system, that our results are improving. We're not there yet. We're not there. Which brings me back, actually, I find it unbelievable that somebody would question the whole idea of an aspiration towards excellence for every child. It is those kinds of aspirations that a government needs to have and our schools need to have to make sure that that education is first class. To expect and to aspire to less really does our children a disservice.
But so you seem to be contradicting yourself here. You mentioned that we have a real need for a national curriculum which is standardised, and then you go down the academy route. Is this why you did a U-turn?
I don't like to think of it as a U-turn. What I see it as is a government that is listening to the professionals. and listening to parents who are saying, actually, we have good schools, we have outstanding schools, and we don't need to force those into academisation. Obviously, as the research results grow over the years and prove the beneficial impact of academies, that more and more schools will, of their own volition, wish to become academies, as a huge number have done already. So we listened, and it's a really good opportunity for the government, I feel, to focus on the other two categories of schools, those that require improvement and those that are inadequate, that through academisation we can ensure that standards in those schools are driven up.
Okay, we're going to move on for another question now. Thank you very much. This is a question off Twitter here. This is from Andy Powell, who I believe is in Bath, rather than here in the room. Without SATs, he says. No, he's not in a bath, he's actually in the city of Bath. No, this Andy Powell here. It's another Andy Powell. It's not the Andy Powell that I know who lives in Bath. Okay, so Andy Powell, and has baths, of course. He says, without SATs, how instead should schools feed back to the government about how its schools are performing? So you're obviously for SATs in a big way. Anyone want to answer that? How else would schools feed back? Phil? No, Miles first, then, okay.
Why do they need to know?
Good question. Why does the government need to know how well schools are doing?
My comment would be who the schools
belong
to. They don't belong to the government.
Say that again because they won't pick it up.
My comment to back up Miles's point of wisdom is that who do schools belong to? They don't belong to the government. They belong to the local communities which they serve.
Kelly?
I'm thinking of something else completely at the moment. I'm just thinking about some of the comments you've been making about raising standards and ensuring that children develop to the best of their possible potential, all of these things. We've already spoken about the fact that maths and English are given sometimes months and months of priority at the detriment of other subjects. How can children possibly be getting a broad and balanced curriculum, regardless of the national curriculum, if there aren't, as far as I'm aware, of any guidelines in terms of allocation per subject within the primary school setting?
So there are two questions here, really, for the government to answer, I suppose. The first question was from Andy over there, talking about, what about SATs as a reporting tool for the government? And the response was, why did the government need to know how well the school's doing?
Because ultimately, a government that runs the education system in the country needs to have that information. They need to know how their schools are doing. I'm sorry, but I just don't see the issue. I think we all have a right to know how our schools are performing. And can I just answer your other point? Our national curriculum, our no longer very new national curriculum, has the aim of ensuring that children do have a broad and balanced curriculum. But if children don't have basic skills in English and maths, if they are unable to read to an appropriate standard, if they are unable to write to a proper standard, how are they going to access this broad and balanced curriculum? I return to the point I made earlier. If children, when they leave primary school, cannot read properly and cannot write properly and don't have basic numeracy skills, then how are they going to access the rest of this broad and balanced curriculum?
Kelly?
I can respond based on personal experience of my own teaching career. When I have taught many students in Year 7 who have come to me with limited literacy and numeracy ability and have been able to access, dependent on the teaching that they receive and a personalised curriculum, science to a very high level and have excelled.
I have a question here which locks onto all of this. It takes it a step forward, actually. It moves it forward into the curriculum itself now. And the question goes forward. Maybe I'll start with Phil first on this one. Does the current curriculum prepare children for the future? I'll leave you to think about that for a few seconds. Who wants to answer? Kelly, do you want to go first?
As long as it's very English and mathematics focused.
Well, we were looking at the curriculum document today that was published in 2014, the current national curriculum, and we looked at it, didn't we? And we saw that out of the 180 pages, over 100 of them were actually for English and maths, and the rest were all the other subjects. And that should show you the emphasis that the national curriculum plays. Rhiannon's got a question at the back there, James. So would you like to maybe pass the microphone on to Phil? Phil, does the current curriculum prepare children for the future?
No, I don't think it does. I don't think there's enough emphasis on the broader curriculum, on the we're talking primary here, aren't we, particularly?
Yes.
I don't think there is enough emphasis on the broader curriculum, on what it means to be a responsible, contributing member of a community or society. While I do agree with Nikki that English and mathematics and having a certain level of ability is very important, I think we have lost sight, I think Miles was implying this earlier, we've lost sight of a rich curriculum which meets the needs of every child who are all different. They're all, to use a term from the early years, unique, and prioritising English and mathematics to the detriment of a richer curriculum, I don't think meets the needs of children as they prepare for the future.
Miles, your response to the question, is the current curriculum preparing children for the future?
I think the national curriculum doesn't, but I think schools fight against the national curriculum and try to do what they can to offset it. So I think the curriculum itself doesn't help, but I think schools fight against it to try and create those opportunities where they can. I think the very good schools will try everything they can to make the curriculum relevant. But the problem is it's a national curriculum, so for a lot of people that is not going to be relevant. So what's happening in London, if you're living in Helston, isn't that relevant? Some children may never ever visit London, so why do I need to learn about it? Why don't I need to learn about the rest of the UK? Worth having a rough idea, but actually having a rich embedded curriculum based in your local area, I think would be much more valuable. And I think a lot of the knowledge base of the curriculum isn't that relevant. I think preparing people for transferable skills would be much more valuable.
So the criticism there is that the curriculum is too knowledge-based and not enough skills-based. I'm assuming. Yes, government response?
Just feel like there's two key points that I really want to raise before we move on to another question. Is that really, if you're going to say that children in Helston, you're going to assume that they will never visit London, therefore they don't need to know anything about London. It's like saying, well, I'm never going to meet a Roman, or I'm never going to meet an ancient Egyptian, therefore I don't need to know anything about them. That's an incredibly narrow view of the curriculum, surely. But what I want to say, the two points I really want to make, English and maths. Don't want to repeat myself, but without those basic essential skills, children cannot access a broader, richer curriculum. There's not a huge amount to talk about. We are educating children for a future that we don't know what it's going to be like. The children don't know what it's going to be like. At least if they've got those basic skills of being able to read and write and to be numerate, that they can engage with whatever the future has to hold for them. And the second point I want to make is... and the next point I want to make is that what what we are really aiming to do in terms of equality of education is to narrow, diminish, ultimately get rid of the unacceptable gap that exists between children from a disadvantaged background and those who are not. That talk of closing the gap is absolutely at the heart of what this government is trying to do. Hence the introduction of millions of pounds of funding through pupil premium to ensure that children have got those basic English and maths skills, so that that gap is narrowed and is, as I say, completely diminished, so that every child, no matter what their background, they have that right
This is now beginning
to that
to sound
quality
like
education system.
This is now beginning to sound like a party political broadcast. I think we ought to move across and have another response here.
My point about maths and English, obviously I understand that mathematics and English are very important. However, I think you're talking about children who maybe come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and I believe that there may be some generalisation occurring there, but we won't go into that right now. Having come from technically a disadvantaged background myself. However, I would like to kind of draw attention to the fact that if we are trying to ensure that children are learning maths and English at the detriment of other subjects, surely children that find it difficult to do maths and English are going to switch off from education. And that's my concern. If we're not delivering a broad and balanced curriculum, children may switch off because their talents, their successes, their skills, their abilities in other areas, because not everyone is good at maths and English. Some children take a lot longer than others to develop the same skills as the person next to them. Sometimes it might take a child until secondary school to actually really gain brilliant handwriting or very good understanding. And I think that children who are only doing maths and English, or doing a lot more of that depending on the school and everything else, are possibly going to disengage from education, and that's my main concern. So surely we're not ensuring success for all of the children, are we?
Okay, we'll come back to this discussion in a moment. Is your question related to that, or is it?
Kind of. Yeah.
Go on, follow through.
So if there's such a big emphasis on the wider curriculum and the broad curriculum, why, when we get to university, are we only tested on our maths and our English?
Who wants to answer that?
Historically, bachelor's education students haven't been. You would have been tested on also science during your degree here, because we do believe it's part of the core curriculum. But it's, again, I believe, influenced by the government. So if I had my way, you'd all be tested on science. Perhaps we could do that. What do you think? Just before you go.
Miles?
Can I just start out? Do you mean the pre-entry test, the skills tests?
Yeah.
Yeah, which actually a point for Nikki, that if your SATs are so robust, and so is the GCSE, why don't we actually trust those results when they come to university? So we have to get them to take an additional test to see if their English and maths are the right level. And just to add to that, why, where we have areas of grammar school, do they have their own 11 plus test? Why don't they trust the Key Stage 2 SATs?
Really interesting walking around in the shoes of a government minister. Not to say challenging. If I'm going to entrust my child into the hands of a teacher, I want to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that the literacy and numeracy skills of that teacher are second to none. If we're going to aspire to our first-class education system, then the teachers in it need to reflect those standards too. And I see no harm whatsoever in ensuring doubly ensuring that the teachers that we are training for the future, for our children, are of the best quality. I make no excuse for that. And I can't think of anybody, actually, who would argue against it.
Can I have a point? So, but these QTS tests, they only test you on that singular point. So you could be absolutely rubbish at maths, but pass the QTS test because you did loads of revision, you did loads of work, not what I did. So yeah, I don't think that's a true representation of how good you are at maths, how good you are at English. I think it's just a matter of how much you revise. So that's, just like the SATs. So what is the point of them?
That's the fatal flaw in SATs is being said here. It's the same fatal flaw that you see in the QTS skills test. It's a snapshot of the here and now. We'll come to you in a moment over here. What's your response?
Well, aren't they a valuable indication of somebody's ability, and can highlight any concerns that there might be with somebody's mathematical or literacy skills?
Any other comments before we move the microphone across to a question from over here? Okay, let's get the microphone across, and then there's one at the back as well. So down the front here first, the light blue shirt.
I see the value of the government defining the curriculum, because it means that professionals can have a say, and so can industry, and everybody can have a say. The only people that can't have a say in that curriculum is the children. So what's your thoughts on lowering the voting age so that children can vote for the government as well?
If we had children voting for the government, what would happen? That's a big question, Steph. Now, this is a precedent because it happened in the Scottish referendum, didn't it, where the voting age was brought down to 16. Now, that's an interesting one. What if it was brought down lower than that again? I think I'm not sure. We have to check on that. But it was certainly brought down for the Scottish referendum. So the question is about if children voted, would there be a difference?
Would make a distinction between children and young people here. I think I'll put my hand up and say that I'm quite happy with the voting age at 18. I wouldn't bring it down.
We wouldn't lower it from 18?
No.
Okay.
What I'm going to do here is come out of role. Thankfully for you, definitely for me. But it's an interesting exercise in appreciating a different point of view. My personal point of view, I would definitely lower the age of voting to 16, generally, for all elections. I think, bearing in mind what young people are legally able to do at 16, it's ludicrous in cases that they then can't vote. If you can marry at 16, then why can't you vote for the future of your country? And I actually think it does. I think it does a disservice to the intelligence of our 16-year-olds, and to assume that they don't know anything about government in order to vote. It does have implications for a PSHE curriculum in secondary schools, and indeed in primary schools, in terms of education about democracy and how a democratic system works. But that would be good. That would be a good thing, from my point of view. And that's really me.
Okay, Kelly.
I think it's a great idea, particularly if you take into consideration anyone who's considering going to university, and the fact that at 16, if you were able to vote, thinking about the concept of tuition fees and all of those things, and the government bringing in particularly high tuition fees, etc. Having the ability to vote for a government that may change that, I don't know, would be really interesting. And there are issues that perhaps 18-year-olds maybe wouldn't consider that 16-year-olds would for their future in terms of their education, especially.
Miles.
I'm going to answer this with two parts. One is, yes, if you're going to have people who can fight for their country at 16, die for their country, yes, they should have a vote. So we make it consistent. So either you do that at 16 or you move that to 18. So I think whatever the age is that you are taking responsibility for your life in a big way, yes. But my counter to that is our democratic system isn't democratic anyway. So you may well bring them into vote at 16, but you're still probably going to find the person in government is the person that most of the country didn't vote for. So I think our democratic system needs to change.
So it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government always gets in. Yeah, okay.
But actually, our majority system, first past the post system, most people, even with a majority government, did not vote for that government. So more people in the country didn't want the current government in, even when they have a landslide victory.
We're not going to get into discussion around things like proportional representation and the electoral system, but you can see that there's an issue there. There's a question at the back here.
With regards to the government trying to raise standards in education, I think it could be argued that they already have. For example, more people are going to university than ever have before. More people are getting better grades at their GCSE and A level, and possibly record numbers at SATs. I think in a lot of cases the government has responded by making these tests more difficult. So my point is there a stage at which standards will ever be high enough, or are we simply going to continue with educational inflation forever?
So it's a very interesting question with lots of complexity in it. Who wants to respond?
So we continue with raising standards until we've got 100% pass rate in SATs and GCSE and A level, and that everybody is achieving the norm, which makes a mockery, doesn't it? I quite agree. Out of that agenda for that ever rising standards, or certainly through testing, it could be argued, and I think any secondary colleagues might agree, that the change to GCSE grading from A star downwards from grade 1 to grade 9, there's statistics out that show that from last week that the percentage of young people achieving grade 9 will be considerably less than the percentage of young people achieving A star at GCSE. And you could argue, if you were cynical, which of course I'm not, that actually is a way of reducing that ever increasing rise in exam results. Because otherwise you do end up with a system where everybody's passing at wonderful levels.
I have some questions here on Twitter. There's a Mr. Yard somewhere in the audience. They're all pointed to him. There he is up there, blushing away gently.
So much for anonymity.
English and maths, he says. English and maths lead to a better understanding of other subjects. However, are all of the skills that are now required in the curriculum necessary? So, is there a redundancy, he's asking, in the curriculum? Are we teaching subjects that are no longer required? Good question, isn't it?
I'm not sure if we're teaching subjects that are necessarily no longer required, because I don't want to be in a position where I am the person defining the curriculum overall, if I'm honest. I think that's a pretty tricky thing to do. But I was discussing with colleagues earlier that it would be interesting to bring in things like psychology for children, and actually start them thinking about, why is that person responding to me like this? Why am I responding to them like this? And I think that skills like that are particularly useful in later life. So I think I've avoided that again.
Miles?
If you've got a system where you're judging people on English and maths, you could say that actually we teach them lots of irrelevant subjects and we might as well get rid of them. But if you don't believe, if you believe in a balanced, broad curriculum, and we could judge children on their own abilities, then we need to give them that breadth so they can discover what they're good at. And I actually feel that maybe part of the argument we need to be thinking is, should we be subject-based? Finland's made a very brave decision to move away from subject-based. This time next year I might be able to tell you some sort of first impressions, see how that works out. But when you look at the EYFS, it's not subject-based. The subjects were within areas of learning, and it's more relevant, it's more like real life. And maybe we need to move into that way, so actually children get a chance to experience things which they can connect to in like the real world, rather than in discrete subjects.
So are you talking about authentic learning here? Learning that's connected to activities that are real life, rather than theoretical stuff?
Yeah, so learning things more in context.
Okay. Microphone's going to be passed to Phil. Can we welcome James Bethany? I'll come to James in a moment for his views on this.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that I didn't realise that the Finns had taken that decision, Miles. The question led me to think of how we operate in the early years, and it is very much an areas of learning type approach. And for your essay, if you've not already found it, the Cambridge Primary Review, which was published in 2009, was advocating very much an areas based approach to what they were working towards, which was a new curriculum, basically, for this primary curriculum for this country. Political events overtook things, and it was quietly sidelined, but it's still very much an active research-based organisation based in the University of Cambridge. Robin Alexander heads it up, and you'll find some very interesting reading there, and I recommend you to have a look at it. I think that really would be the way to go, but unfortunately politics got very much in the way. There was a change of government, and it was, as I say, quietly sidelined. If I could just for a minute, as I've got the microphone, just go back to Kath's question about what would happen if the government was removed from education. I think one of the positive things that we would see is that we would see a lot more stability in the education system, because the nature of politics is that things have to be rather short term. They have to be, when politicians are involved, they have to be designed around a term of government, and they've got very much their eyes on what can be achieved before the next election. And that has resulted in all sorts of revisions, reviews and changes, which again have been very costly, but have been very unsettling, if not for children, for the teaching profession itself.
So James, would you like to respond to the idea of the question of curriculum? What's it made of? What's relevant? What's irrelevant?
So the sort of idea that perhaps there might be redundancy within that curriculum. I think that still kind of hinges on the idea that we should have one curriculum for all, and this idea that our colleague from the government has been talking about standardised testing when we were talking about testing, and this idea that there's somewhere out there a standard child, or at least one of them, you know, who we're targeting all of this Education Act. And in that instance, yes, you know, for many children, a large proportion of the curriculum might be redundant. And for another child, it will be a different proportion of that curriculum that's redundant. And for another child, it may be yet another part of that curriculum that's redundant. So I don't think this idea of standardisation and of having standardised curriculum is going to be helpful to every single child. Now, the government's going to be aiming to target their idea of what is best for most children. And, you know, if you think of, from a sort of philosophical point of view, you know, Jeremy Bentham talks about the most benefit for the most number within society, which is kind of the foundations of democratic government systems. And that's where we're going with our curriculum, is we're aiming for the largest benefit for the largest number. So it's inevitable that there is going to be some redundancy if we standardise things. But that redundancy isn't going to be for every child.
Are you back as Nikki now?
No.
All right, okay, fine. This is Kath speaking.
I've got a headache. But interestingly, and I'm not talking as a government representative, but one of the principles of the new national curriculum is that it does give it allegedly freed up time for schools to focus on the learning that was appropriate to their school and their community. That these are the essentials, but there is time, as I say, freed up for schools to do the things that they want to do in school. And of course, in reality, that hasn't happened. Because of the assessment system, then what we have is, well, if we've got some more time, then we're going to have to spend more time focusing on English and maths, because that's what children are going to be tested on, because that's how the school is judged, because that's how people's jobs are going to be judged. So that hasn't happened. I mean, to have yet another review of the national curriculum, I think would fill every educationalist with horror at this stage. But what I think reviews have failed to do over the years is actually there's been an awful lot of tinkering around the edges, and what it's failed to do is actually, what I would like to do is to take the national curriculum and throw it up in the air and look what lands and sort out what we want from it, is to actually really, really review it and say, actually, a curriculum that still looks very much like the one that was introduced 300, 400 years ago, so how valid is that in 2016, is to actually really go right back to the basics and say how much of anything is relevant hundreds of years later, and think what the purpose was of the curriculum when it was first introduced and what role education was playing in society, which is very different to what it is now, is to really, really overhaul it completely, and that way there will be redundancy. And one of the debates my group had in the very first seminar was about the role of handwriting, and we had a number of people who were very passionate about handwriting and the need to teach it and that really valuable skill to have, opposed to people who said, well, when was the last time we actually wrote anything other than a shopping list, or actually wrote anything by hand. And there's an awful lot of debate out there, lots of interesting reading on what's the value of teaching handwriting in 2016.
Well, here's a question for you about that.
And I don't know, to be honest.
It's a question about this for all of you, actually, and I know I was discussing this with James and Kelly earlier on. Handwriting now has become a tool for you to write notes to yourself. It's very rarely used as a tool to present information to other people. Is that correct? Most of us now use text if we're going to be communicating to somebody else. So your view, James, was quite interesting, wasn't it, on this? Do you want to elaborate on your
I just wondered whether maybe we should teach handwriting in art, and it should become an art form. You know, joined up, nice cursive calligraphy, yeah. And once you can kind of print the basic letters of the alphabet, so write yourself a shopping list and make a quick note that you can read, that's all you need in life, really. And then when we do writing, maybe inverted commas and things, at least be able to write something that's beautiful.
And then would you replace the handwriting, the handwriting part of literacy, would you replace that then with typing, as you say, or texting?
With, touch typing, much more useful skill, I think, in this day and age, to be able to...
Go on, Kath.
I think somewhere out there, and do look for it, there is research that makes a positive link between handwriting and spelling.
So you're saying keep it?
Sorry?
You're saying keep it?
No, I'm not giving a personal view. I'm just
All right.
saying that there is, on the other side of the argument, that because, and particularly with cursive handwriting, that as children are concentrating about how to make a specific join between an E and a T or an R, that what they're actually also doing is learning how to spell that word.
Well,
and that there are those links. Sorry? It does count as phonics.
It counts as phonics, it's a phonic aspect. But Phil might have a view on this, because when I went over to work in America, I realised that actually over in America they don't teach cursive writing to children until they're 7 years old. Is it an early years skill, do you think, or is it something that should be hived later on in the curriculum?
Well, in this country, in the early years, early letter formation is definitely taught in the early years.
What should it be?
I'm not sure that, following James's argument, that I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure about the benefits of it. I mean, there's the fine motor skills and hand-eye coordination part of it, which is useful. But in the long term, how beneficial will it be in terms of a foundation for beautiful cursive script later on?
We could have a straw poll here, I think, couldn't we, about this? Put your hand up if you think that cursive writing should stay where it is and be taught as it is now. Put your hand up. All right.
Come on, be bold, be brave.
Go on, put your hand up. There's about 4 or 5 of you. Put your hand up if you think it should be changed and we should be teaching something else there instead. There's a lot more hands going up. That's interesting, isn't it? Any response to that from any of you? James?
It's really interesting because it's a point I bring up sometimes in seminars over the last 3 or 4 years when I've been doing this. And when I first asked it 3 years ago, you would have seen the vast majority would have said keep handwriting. And in that 3 years, your perspective as trainee teachers, as people going into the profession, has changed. So that's fascinating in itself.
Take the mic there. I'm going to move up here because there's somebody who has a question up here, right at the back. Over here. So, fire away.
But there's a difference between cursive handwriting and handwriting in general, because you just asked about whether we should do cursive handwriting, but what I think is we should be teaching clear writing, because I know that everybody here has had to mark 30 kids' work one night, and if their handwriting is beautiful cursive, but you can't quite read what the letter is, what's the point? I'd rather it was clear and not joined than...
I think this is a basic literacy skill that we're talking about here, isn't it, really? If you can't communicate in writing, but, the question still remains, I think, is it still a valid skill for the 21st century when we've got technology that can do it for us?
So I was just thinking about the last time you wrote something for someone else to read when it was handwritten. So at the moment, we still ask children to do all of their work to handwrite it,
But that would mean you'd have to have a child have a laptop every single time.
Yeah, and that's definitely not the case at the moment. And the question arises, is it changing? Is it going to go that way? Is the way children share their ideas and encode their ideas and write down their ideas going to change to be more in line with what the adult world...
Okay, we've got 2 or 3 comments over here. Let's take this one here first. Laura?
So do you think that children should learn the cursive handwriting? Because personally I think it's really good at remembering how to spell, because a lot of children remember the flow of the letters and that is how they remember the words, but maybe that they shouldn't be assessed on it. Because I know in year 2 to now be above age-related expectations, they have to know something like 5 different joins between letters. So do you think that children should learn the cursive handwriting but not be assessed on it, or just scrap handwriting altogether?
I think that's really interesting. You could argue that children being forced to write in a cursive style, and there are still a large number of primary schools that have adopted a specific way of joining their own, their own particular style. All children will write like this. All joins will be done like this. That's a great disservice to those children who don't have those fine motor skills in order to execute that with any degree of comfort. And that what it does, it puts a barrier between that communication of ideas and what a child actually knows. Because if they're struggling to write legibly, then that detracts from them being able to communicate what it is that they actually know. There's also a school of thought that the most common medium of communication when we leave full-time education is exactly what we've been doing this afternoon, which is talking to each other. And that's something that has definitely fallen by the wayside in the national curriculum. But the whole idea of speaking and listening and communicating is such an important skill for the future, and we don't need handwriting at all, maybe.
While Kath was talking, I was just having a quick look around the room, and I'm sort of thinking in a personalised learning sort of way. Looking around the room, we've got some people using phones, some people using pens, some people using pencils, laptops. What we're sort of doing is enforcing a system on people, whereas you've got the freedom to use whatever method you want. So it could be that we said, actually, you can only take notes if you handwrite them. And my argument to that is it depends on the person. Your generations coming through have had more use of keyboard skills than my generation coming through. So the speed you write on a keyboard is probably a lot faster than my speed. So it may be a more efficient way. So it's finding whatever's the best mechanism. Now I use all sorts of things. I use an iPad, an iPhone, I use pen and paper in a notebook, I use a laptop, I use a computer. I choose the best method for me at that time. So if I'm doing a shopping list, it tends to be handwritten. But other communication is electronic. So I choose the most appropriate means. And I think what we need to do as teachers with the children is teach them the full range. So we need to teach them how to handwrite. I wouldn't necessarily all say we have to do that in a recognised form. Like we don't tell you when you're typing that you have to use Arial font 12. We do it in your assignments, but that's different. But there isn't a standard way that you have to do it. You can choose the most appropriate script. And the key thing is, can you communicate?
I just think it's funny that you're saying that writing is something that we don't need to do anymore, whereas every single person in this room has had to write on a whiteboard because we're teachers. It's just more common than anything else. I just think it's quite, I don't know, I think it's just weird that how you're saying we don't need to do it anymore, and then we have to write the date on the board, we have to show children, because if children aren't shown in school how to write, or show people writing, they might not see it at home because their parents might have phones or computers and never actually engage in any writing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do kind of present that argument to be a little bit controversial. Although you say that, I've a friend who's a very successful teacher. He, school got outstanding in Ofsted, and he got excellent SAT results in a mixed class with all of Key Stage 2 in it. And he did very little writing on the board. He used to do everything on the screen, and he'd type it all. It would all be typed. He was also a very efficient typist, so he didn't have to look at what he was doing. He could be typing like this, talking to his children, and it would be coming up on the screen. And for him, typing as a skill was like a dance. It was fun to play for. He's an excellent guitarist as well. I hate him, but that's a whole different matter. For me, I'm not a particularly proficient typist, so it takes a lot of my attention to actually physically type. I tend to write everything by hand. Well, not everything, but if I'm writing creatively, I would write by hand because, the thought process involved are definitely involved, as you said, Kath, within that movement. But is that because I'm an inefficient typist and I have to bludgeon my way through it, therefore it's not beautiful, therefore my thinking is not beautiful? So if children learn to type beautifully, is they learn it as a skill that becomes automatic, that becomes playful, rather than something that becomes forced. Does that then enable them to access stuff? And we could debate this fairly endlessly, really. And I'm just wondering whether the world is coming to a point whereby having that level of proficiency with creating typed texts is going to be more useful than having it with creating written texts.
So I'm just quite curious as to how much writing he does. So with marking, is that typed, or does he write that?
He writes that by hand, yeah.
So,
yeah. I'm talking sort of, you talked about on the whiteboard particularly there, so that specific skill of teachers. Yeah, and it's always going to be useful. Yeah. Okay, but we no longer give you handwritten feedback on your essays. I think in your first year, most of you would have got handwritten feedback on your essays. Is that right? Do you prefer it this way now that it's typed?
You don't have to decipher our scroll, do you, anyway? I suppose. We're still on the subject of the 21st century curriculum, a curriculum that is relevant to the needs of today's generation. Bear in mind that the children you're teaching now were born in this century. You were educated in the last century and part of this century, but they're coming up behind you and they're seeing things and doing things that you didn't have at school. So I'd be interested in the panel's response to this question. What is it that we don't teach at the moment that we should be teaching? What is it that isn't in the curriculum right now that should be? Anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah. I'm thinking sort of basic life skills. I'm also thinking that a lot of the things that are probably come into my head are things that primary schools do. So cooking, so being able to survive, being able to navigate efficiently, not in a geographical way based on the curriculum, but actually be able to find your way around places, be able to light a fire, being able to use a knife safely. A lot of things which are taught through forest schools. Also maybe maths in proper context, so actually think about budgeting, decision making, how do you weigh up things. And I know in my group we talked about actually bartering as a skill, which as an adult you need to know.
I suppose we would call that negotiation, wouldn't we?
Negotiation.
Posh terms. James, what should we be teaching that we don't at the moment?
I think particularly, and it is present, you know, some people may say it comes in under science, but I think it's much broader than that, and that's the idea of sustainability and actually the issues that we're faced with in modern worlds. You know, we talked about a growth-based model of learning, this always raising standards, and we have a growth-based economic model on a planet of finite resources. And you know, there's various debates and so on around climate change and the science side of things, but actually there's a lot more to the concept of sustainability, this idea of interconnected thinking, that actually everything we do has an impact on something else, that the Earth is a whole system, and yet we teach in discrete subjects. So we separate these subjects out and we don't make those thematic connections that the Rose Review that Phil mentioned, or the Cambridge Review that Phil mentioned was advocating. So I think sustainability and that interconnected thinking is one element, and also this idea of social responsibility, and that also comes into sustainability, this idea of actually having an understanding of equality on a global scale, and how education can actually influence people's attitudes towards each other.
Okay. Any other comments, Kath or Phil?
I think in primary schools, we do say that we are, apart from the national curriculum, focused on teaching those skills, those skills that enable us to develop tolerance and to respect each other and to listen and to be open-minded. And I think a lot of primary schools do that well, but I'd certainly want even greater focus on that. We talk about it being okay for children to fail and to teach them that it is okay to get things wrong. Because that's the way that we learn. Unfortunately, as we've shown this afternoon, in an assessment-driven curriculum in schools, then I'm not sure how much we actually really do say it actually is, it's okay to fail. But certainly children who are flexible and adaptable and that will challenge and question whatever it is that life has to throw at them in the future, for that being able to be excited and to embrace that whole notion of change. So those kinds of sort of skills, ethos-based things. When we were talking, Sophie's question about lowering the age of voting to 16, I would like to see much more done, much more opportunities for children to learn about our democratic system, whatever that democratic system is. But certainly how it works and why it works as it does, and how children can play their part in having their say about what their future world is like. And I personally think that, I think it's a crying shame that at elections, whether they're for police commissioners or whether it's for the forthcoming EU referendum, that there isn't 100% turnout. That people do want to and do take that opportunity to have their say in how their world is run. So I'd like to see more on that.
Building on, I think, what both James and Kath has said, I'd just like to say that I think we do a lot of this already in primary schools, but I'd like to be a bit more explicit in teaching values and attributes and ideas, and I'll put words on them like compassion, words like forgiveness, words like humility, because I think we are rushing headlong into a very individualistic society, and while children need to be strong and resilient, I think they need also to be aware that there is another way to be. We don't have to all be excellent, we don't all have to be outstanding everywhere all of the time. As Kath has said, we need to show children that it's okay to fail, it's okay to make mistakes, but still be able to feel good about that. Not about making a mistake necessarily, but being able to weather the storm and continue on, and realising that that's not the end of the world, because in the competitive world that we live in, sometimes people can very easily feel that they don't match up, they don't shape up to the ideal image. And that's very unfortunate, and I think primary schools as well as secondary schools need to be more clear about showing children and young people that there is a different way.
I found that very interesting, hearing from all four panellists, because what they've said, I think, what you've all said, is that essentially everything that is offered here could be already, or could be included in the curriculum we teach now. Which leads me to the conclusion that actually it's all about the teacher. So the teacher, it's how you interpret what you want the children to learn through the subjects that you're going to teach. And I think that should give you a clue about how you're going to address this silent question, who should define the curriculum. So I think we're not going to prolong this anymore now. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm going to give one more question, the killer question, to all the panellists here now. Who should define the curriculum? Short, quick answers.
Shall I? Happy?
Kath first.
Yeah. I think primarily it should be teachers and educationists, people who actually know what they are talking about in terms of education.
Okay.
I agree with Nikki.
Would Nikki have said that?
Well, I don't know. She might have done, but tarnished with other things.
I think absolutely, as my colleagues have said, it should be teachers, but I think they've missed out an essential stakeholder, if you want to use that kind of term, in education. That's the children. Children should absolutely be involved in what they want to learn and what they're excited by as well.
I'm going to go for the teachers and educationists, but thinking more on a local level rather than a national level.
Okay. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. I'd like you to really thank our panellists today, all of them for what they've done. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful. And the cameo role there by Nikki Morgan, I think, was absolutely brilliant. Well done, Kath.